Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip are marching along the so-called buffer zone with Israel for the 8th consecutive day to protest the regime's occupation of their motherland. Israeli soldiers have once again opened fire on peaceful protesters, killing one of them and injuring several others. Jason, I'll start with you, if I may. What do you make of this second week now, eighth day essentially, of these ongoing protests? Protests which are nonpartisan in nature, are led completely on a grassroots movement by the Palestinian people themselves.
Well, this is the inevitable result of what Israel is doing to Palestine. For decades, they've had a free hand to just roll over the Palestinian people however they want and have suffered no consequences as a result. The UN has been completely ineffective in standing up to the killings, the targeted assassinations, the destruction of Palestine that Israel has been carried out. And if you oppress somebody, there is going to be resistance to it. This should not be seen as, as unexpected, and I'm sure nobody does. It is a righteous struggle by the Palestinians to stand up to what Israel is doing, and the more the Israelis push down on the Palestinians, the harder the Palestinians are going to push back. And this is just an example of just that. If the Palestinians will be there, will protest peacefully, will not use violence, Israelis will come in and kill them. And I think that these 21, I believe now 22 deaths is nothing more than a perfect example of what Israel stands for. It's a perfect example of what Israel has always done, and the world has completely stood by and allowed to happen. The Palestinians are merely defending their own right to land. I mean, the Palestinians are literally just standing there, non-violent, just protesting, and they are still being killed by Israel while the world watches. And it seems like that none of the major powers in the world seem to have any concern for the people being killed whatsoever, because we know that they're getting away with this because of Israel, partly because of the United States. So long as Israel is in the pocket of the United States, so long as Israel continues to be a perfect vessel for U.S. interests in the region, Israel is going to have a free hand to do basically whatever it wants. This kind of behavior would not be tolerated by anybody but a U.S. ally. We need look no further than the example of Saudi Arabia inside of Yemen right now. Anytime a country does any tiny little thing, even be something twisted into something that it's not, the United States is always the first to scream bloody murder about what's going on and call for international interference into the situation to try to solve it, whether there's a real problem or not, so long as it's not a country that follows U.S. interests, so long as it's not a client state. But I mean, it's a very politics can tend to be very complicated, but this is a very simple situation. Palestinians are peacefully protesting. They're standing there fighting for their rights in a non-violent way, and Israel is just seemingly killing them as they feel, almost as if as the soldiers feel they're bored. I mean, they're not just rolling in and destroying everything. It's more like they're just having fun with them. And I think this is something that we've seen with Israel for some time. Snipers can act whenever they feel like it. I mean, but there's no reason for them to act at all right now. This is something that they're just doing because they feel like doing it. They have no real reason to attack Palestinians. Yet we are in a situation where they are free to act whenever they want. And it's baffling that this is the kind of thing that the UN has been allowing to go on, that these killings can go unpunished for decades because nobody can really stand up to Israel because of the economic and military powers standing behind the United States. And it's disgusting that even many of the American people themselves so openly celebrate this alliance with Israel.
Jason, I wanted to, if you allow me, highlight, as John there was talking about the coverage of what's happening, not just in Gaza, of course, but even in the occupied West Bank, in solidarity with Gazans and their grassroots movement. You know, inside Gaza, Jason, we know the Palestinians have built a tent encampment with different tents, and those are corresponding to the various villages and towns that were destroyed during the Nakba, or the catastrophe, in 1948. That's very symbolic, is it not? And that's quite an important move, isn't it? Which I imagine many are not talking about simply because of its peaceful nature.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if Palestinians resist in a peaceful way, the media doesn't bother covering it whatsoever. Now, they might get a 20-second mention in some kind of news highlight, but they won't bother particularly looking into it. But if a single Palestinian child throws a stone at one Israeli armored vehicle, then it becomes, it's some of the most dramatic attacks against the Israelis who didn't do anything, and they're just poor, persecuted minority inside of an Arab world in that region. It is very obvious that that's not going to be properly covered. If they don't cover that, they're probably not going to cover all the tents that are set up to take the place of homes that have been destroyed by Israelis to begin with. I mean, the Western media knows who fills their pockets. They know who they work for, and as a result of that, they're not going to cover it. As long as the relationship between the United States and Israel is beneficial for the United States, the U.S. media will go along with all the dishonesties that are necessary to try to portray Israel as the victim in this situation. I think it's wholly appropriate that they wouldn't show this when the real life situation is so completely different. They like to portray Israel as a victim when very clearly it's Palestine who lives with the Israeli boot on their neck. Do Palestinians control who can come in and out of Israel? No, it's Israelis who can control who comes in and out of Palestine. If they have that kind of bureaucratic and military authority, how can we possibly see Palestine as the victim? I mean, possibly see Israel as the victim in this situation? It's complete nonsense. I mean, it's a growing trend now that people in the West don't believe the media that they're being fed by the upper classes, the ruling class within the U.S. Upwards of 70% of Americans alone don't believe the narrative of the information that's being fed to them by the mainstream media. And I think that's very reflective of that. Yet in some cases, they will mindlessly believe something they're being told, even though they don't believe, in general, they don't trust the media that's feeding it to them. And it seems that the Israel-Palestine conflict seems to be one of those in general. I mean, there's a growing awareness around the world of what Israel is actually doing to Palestine as information has become more prevalent among people, particularly with regards to the internet and the essentially almost total free access of information that provides. But it shouldn't be seen as surprising anyway that the Western media would completely ignore some kind of peaceful protest action, because this doesn't go along with the narrative that they're trying to portray, that somehow the Palestinians are the aggressors who have been trying to destroy Israel for X amount of time. They wield so much power over the poor, innocent Israelis. I mean, it's just one of those reasons why we really shouldn't trust the mainstream media and look to other alternative sources like Press TV as a good example of that, and why in general it's so necessary to look for yourself, look for information yourself, seek out alternative sources, because this is the kind of thing that's covered up by the mainstream media.
Jason, I wanted to ask you as well about the right of return, because that's something that's again not spoken about much, as John correctly pointed out as well, that many people simply do not talk about that really much, especially in the West. How important is that factor, do you think, in all this?
It's a very important factor. It's probably a very large determining factor in this case. This is land that has been stolen. I mean, there's no one of a rational mind who could claim that this land isn't stolen. It's really baffling. Like I said, you lose the adjectives to be able to describe this situation. It seems like the most basic and obvious history of Israel, it just can't enter the mainstream narrative. Nobody seems to really want to acknowledge the fact that a military force essentially just rolled over Palestine, put up arbitrary walls based on what it is, whatever they wanted. It's almost like a buffet of wants. They could just pick and choose whatever they want, fill up their plate with as much Palestinian land as they wanted, and seem to be going back for seconds, thirds, fourths, and fifths by creating newer and greater settlements, and while the Palestinians are just completely pushed off the table entirely, with no say in being able to access, frankly, anything, and they witness their own lives, their own land, their own history, their own culture gradually shrink as Israel expands, one settlement at a time, coming to, as I'm sure they hope they will, dominate the entire country until there is no Palestinian, there is no Palestine left. And I think it's a big part about this. Struggling to find the appropriate words for it in this for this medium. It's really disgusting what's going on, and it's just so. It's so appropriately Israeli that you have this nonpartisan, please just don't kill us, kind of message coming out from Palestinians who essentially they're still getting killed. They're getting shot at with tear gas. Someone was just killed again. All they're doing is standing by a fence. They're just standing by a fence, yelling slogans, just in general, expressing themselves nonviolently, and they're not even allowed to do that. They're not even allowed to just stand by a fence and not commit an act of violence. You're not allowed to just stand there and push a message of please stop killing us. You get killed for saying please don't kill us. It's baffling that this isn't made out to be,
Right.
A bigger crime than it is.
Jason, I wanted to go back to that ad I spoke about, geared towards Palestinian women, discouraging them from coming out. Many people online saying it's interesting that this ad was only released in Arabic. Do you think that the Israelis know that such tactics really do hurt its image? Not that its image is good anyways, but do you think that the Israelis are in a sense almost embarrassed to have to do these sorts of things, discourage women from coming out to stand up for their own rights?
Well, I think putting out an ad like this is less embarrassing than being found for having shot at an innocent woman in the head. I suppose that, given the choice of which one's going to be on your public record, murdering an innocent woman or just putting out something that's, ridiculously sexist like this, saying that they have to stay home and not be involved in politics, the idea of, don't really get involved with the fact that we're stealing your land, killing your family members, destroying your home, bombing your hospitals. I mean, it's just simply ridiculous. I mean, this is almost farcical in the face of what's actually happening, what they're telling them not to protest against. I mean, I suppose it would be easier for Israel if people just stayed home and didn't protest the fact that they were being completely destroyed. But, I suppose if in their eyes, if there are less women showing up to protest, then they feel that they have to shoot less women in the head for daring to question what they're doing to Palestine, including women. I think that the record of Palestinian soldiers abusing Palestinian women is long and recorded. They've had a free hand to do whatever they want. Even Ahmed Tamimi, the 17-year-old girl that's being held by Israel right now for slapping a soldier, her lawyer has come out denouncing her Israeli captors of having carried out sexual harassment of her inside of prison. And she's probably even in a women's prison to begin with. I'm not exactly entirely sure of her situation like this, but it's very systematic. This idea that somehow Israelis are concerned about Palestinian women is laughable. I mean, this flyer is an insult to people who would righteously protest against what's happening against them. Israel claiming that it cares about any Palestinian in general is farcical. They don't care. They roll in. They murder anyone who gets in their way. They'll shoot children. They'll throw grenades into homes. Israel showing any kind of concern for Palestinians is nothing short of a lie.
You know, Jason, one of the interesting things, obviously, that happened the moment this March evening, Israel began killing innocent protesters, peaceful protesters, that is, was that Israel outright rejected any calls for an independent investigation into any of its actions, really saying, you know, it'll do as it wishes, and it will continue to, of course, use live fire, as, of course, we're witnessing today, and in the days since last Friday as well. What do you make of that? Because, you know, that's an international community call. That's something that the United Nations has called for, the European Union has called for, not just, of course, the Palestinians themselves.
Well, that sounds basically straight up what Israel is doing. They commit a crime, they kill innocent people, and the UN says, well, we need an independent investigation, as if one was actually really needed. It's actually pretty obvious what's going on, that innocent people are being killed, but they at least want to at least give the veneer that they're doing something by requesting some kind of impartial investigator to go in and look at it. And Israel just says, no, that's okay. We don't need to acknowledge that. I mean, that pretty much says it all. Israel doesn't even want someone to investigate what happened. Not that you would even really need it to begin with. It's pretty obvious. The world, at least the media of the world, knows what's going on, whether they choose to report it or not. But I mean, that's completely symptomatic of how Israel has been able to operate since the beginning. It literally doesn't care about the people that it kills. And it would prefer that the world just not pay attention to what's going on, that they would just stand by while all of this happens, and people not to bother themselves with paying attention to what they're doing to the Palestinians, and not even wanting anything to even be officially on the record by the UN, by having someone come in to investigate it. I mean, this shows the horribly malicious intent of Israel to begin with. If they don't even want someone to be able to come in and possibly even from an unbiased position, catalog the crimes that they've committed, if they have, nothing to hide, that they didn't do anything, then what would be the problem, or what would be the harm in having someone come in and investigate? Well, of course, because they know that they're guilty. They know that they committed a crime. We need only refer to the tweet that the Israeli Defense Force erased, just a little while ago, where they said that they had taken not one single bullet was fired inappropriately, that they were fully accountable for every shot that was fired. And then when it came out that they shot innocent people, they decided to delete that tweet because it made them look culpable for what they actually did, which was shoot innocent, unarmed people. And then to reject a call to have this looked at from an impartial view only seems the most appropriate response, the most Israeli-like response for what they've done.
Jason, I wanted to ask you specifically then about, for example, where you are in Canada and its approach as a government and otherwise, other politicians towards these issues. I know that one of the politicians there in opposition did speak out, Jagmeet Singh, but how have others been reacting there, officially and otherwise?
Well, Canada always has this frankly arrogant veneer that somehow we're very different from the United States, when essentially our history shows that we've been in complete compliance with U.S. imperialism since, say, about ending the war of 1812, when we made peace with the Americans. We have the odd politician that will come out, will denounce it, usually less of the more entrenched parties like the Tories, the Liberals, but more coming out from like the Green Party, etc. But right now, the narrative coming out of politicians, at least, is that frankly, a lot of them are just keeping quiet on the situation. It's one of those things where they know the Canadian public is not going to agree with them, because at least the public tends to be more progressive in Canada than it does the United States. That, you know, they do get much more angry about the plight of the Palestinians than Americans, but the politicians in general know what it is that they should do, that and Israel is more profitable, more beneficial to them than a Palestine. So successive Canadian leaders have essentially been on the side of Israel, if only giving token mentions to Palestinians, or token mentions of the crimes that are being committed against them. Even Canada is looking to criminalize movements like BDS to try to cover up any kind of criticism Israel, label it as hate speech, essentially to protect Israel. I mean, this is the general idea, at least the general consensus from the more entrenched parties in Canada, that to cover up the crimes of Israel. It used to be that the NDP was much more progressive in this point, where they would be critical of it, but still, when it came down to the votes on doing something to Israel or something related to Israel, they would still side with Israel in general. Well, the media has a little bit better coverage of it than the U.S. media. Still, in the end, our system, our politicians in power, and even our media still does side with the Israelis over Palestine, showing their true colors, that despite our desire to be portrayed as the peacekeepers of the world, we're really just a junior partner in imperialism.